Today, we're going to be testing out these slot 1 motherboards which were saved from being scrapped. Let's get started. Taking a closer look at all the boards we've got here, the first one we have is an Asus P2B-VE. Being an early 440BX board, having onboard graphics was a luxury, so this would have been a pretty high-end motherboard for its time. Next up, we've got this Intel branded 440BX motherboard, but there's something special about this board in particular. It features an onboard Yamaha XG sound chip, which is really unheard of for boards from this era, so definitely a great find. Another really nice feature about this board is the fact that it only uses a few large capacitors. This will make it easy to recap if it ever needs to be in the future. Next up, we've got this A-Open motherboard, which appears to be really late model and high end for slot 1. This should be a really nice board. And it's an AX6BC if you were curious. Lastly, we've got this DFI motherboard, which appears to be a pretty generic slot 1 board from the era. However, it does look good quality though, so hopefully it should work well. Anyway, now it's time to go about actually testing these boards. For our CPU, I'll be using a Pentium 2 clocked at 400 MHz, and I'm going to test the Intel board first here. For the RAM, I'll just go with 256MB of PC133 memory. This is pretty overkill, but it should work fine for testing. For our testing graphics card, I'll just go with this Asus Match64 card. I'll go ahead and use a modern power supply too, to ensure that everything works correctly. Alright, now, will it work? Let's see. Well, the answer is no. I've tried all different configurations with this board and nothing will get it to post. It's not even giving out beep codes, so it's really not a good sign. I'm just gonna cut my losses with that last board. It was salvaged from gold scrap anyways, so I didn't really expect it to work, but it's a shame nonetheless. Anyway, let's move on to our A-Open board now, and I've got my trusty Pentium 2 400 plugged in with the CPU fan installed, and now I'll just install my RAM too, as well as the Molex power connector, and also my testing video card, and yeah, we should be good to go. Alrighty, let's see if we can get this one to work. I'm really hoping it will, since that last board was a dud. It looks good so far, and right about now I just heard a BIOS beep, so everything should work. And what do you know, it springs right to life. Good old A-Open. Yeah, just look at that. Apparently it thinks the Pentium 2 is running at 350 MHz, but that should just be a configuration error. Anyway, entering into the BIOS, as we can see, A-Open always make really good stuff, including their BIOSes. So we've got a bunch of features to play around with here, and everything looks really good. So I'm pleased to say that this board was a successful recovery. I'll go ahead and unplug our A-Open board, and next grab our Asus motherboard with the onboard video. This looks like a really high-end motherboard, and Asus always make quality stuff, so hopefully it should work. I don't see any damage either, so it definitely looks promising. Now, these boards were missing the heatsinks on the chipset, so I just had one spare which I put on there just for safety. As I mentioned before, these things were going to be broken down to be scrapped for gold, so they're not perfect, but hopefully they should still work. And we've just about got everything set up. Only thing I'll need to do now is just reconfigure the jumpers to be the correct speed for the CPU. And there we go. Going ahead and powering up the board, as we can see it doesn't look that promising at first, but then I realised I forgot to plug the power connector in, so I'll go ahead and do that. Anyway, once that's done though, we can go ahead and try powering it up again. This time it looks a lot more promising. And the board springs right to life, displaying a Hewlett-Packard logo. However, upon entering into the BIOS, as we can see, there appears to be some graphical corruption. I'm not sure what's causing this, but I don't think it'll be a deal breaker for this board being considered working. It can still function after all. Now let's go ahead and unplug our ASUS board and move on to that DFI one. It looks in pretty good condition, but I'll still go ahead and place a chipset heatsink on there, just for safety. Next, I'll install the CPU, which goes in really easy since there's no retention system on this board. And for some reason, they've placed the CPU fan's power connector very far away from the board, and it took me a while to find it, but eventually I found it here. Next, I'll go ahead and install the RAM underneath those wires, which is a pretty annoying design, and I'll plug in our power connector too. Next, I'll make a minor adjustment to the dip switch so our CPU speed shall be correct. And lastly, I'll go ahead and plug in our testing video card. Anyway, turning the power on, it looks promising, everything's spinning. And would you look at that, the board comes right to life. Awesome! Having a look around in the BIOS, as we can see, everything appears to be working as it should. So that's great. This should be a really nice motherboard to use in a build. So all of our motherboards work, but I actually remembered I have these Ultra cards to test out. The first one being a GeForce 2 Ultra, and our next one being a TNT 2 Ultra. And our last one being yet another TNT 2 Ultra. I'll quickly go ahead and set up the AOpen board, and then I'll try out this Diamond Viper V7700 next. And it appears to be working. How awesome is that? Let's next go ahead and try out our no-name TNT2 Ultra, which appears to work too. How awesome! Out of all these cards, the GeForce 2 Ultra is probably the one I want to work the most. And as my luck would have it, powering up the system, it sure does work. How awesome! Well, that about wraps up today's video. I'm really pleased with our results, though I really would have liked that Intel motherboard to work too. It's really amazing to me how what's considered gold scrap by most can still be very fun and usable even today. But yeah, that about concludes today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.